Oh my God, Daniel. Daniel. Get up. What have I done? I cried, my voice shaking. My heart was beating so fast, and my hands were trembling as I knelt beside him. Daniel, please get up. This has to be a prank, right? You're just pretending to scare me, right? I whispered, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. I shook his shoulder softly at first, then harder, hoping he would move, but he didn't. His body felt cold, his chest wasn't moving, and he wasn't breathing anymore. No, no, this can't be real. Daniel, breathe. Please, breathe. I gasped, my mind spinning in panic. What can I do now? I whispered to myself, covering my mouth with shaky hands. I felt so scared, but I knew I had to do something fast before it was too late. I kept telling myself to be brave, but my body wouldn't move. Time was slipping away, and I needed to act quickly, but I was frozen in fear, unable to think clearly.
Aluu Grammar School was a well-known community school, deep in Aluu local government. The school had good teachers, and they all worked hard to give the students the best education. But there was one teacher who stood out, Mr. Felix, the biology teacher. Mr. Felix had been teaching for more than 10 years. He loved his job and would teach from the morning assembly until the closing bell without getting tired. Everyone knew that teaching was his passion, but there was something about Mr. Felix that made the students scared of him. He was called the Flogger. At the smallest mistake, Mr. Felix would flog students without mercy. He always carried a bundle of long canes with him, ready to punish anyone who didn't follow the rules. Students feared and disliked him, and whenever Mr. Felix was around, the whole school would go silent. Nobody dared to misbehave when he was near. It was a quiet morning at Aluu Grammar School, and Mr. Felix had just finished teaching his first class of the day. As he packed up his books, one of the school messengers walked into the classroom, knocking lightly on the door. "Good morning, sir," the messenger greeted, standing by the door. "Morning," Mr. Felix replied, barely looking up as he arranged his things. "The principal wants to see you in his office," the messenger said, sounding a little nervous. Mr. Felix paused for a moment, wondering why the principal had sent for him. He straightened up and nodded, "All right. I'll be there shortly." As Mr. Felix walked to the principal's office, his mind raced with thoughts. Had something happened? Was it about one of the students? He didn't know, but he walked with confidence. After all, he was a respected teacher who had dedicated over 10 years of his life to this school. When he reached the principal's office, he knocked softly on the door. "Come in," the principal's voice called from inside. Mr. Felix pushed the door open and stepped in. The principal, Mr. Ade, sat behind his large desk, his face calm but serious. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes, known for his fair leadership and gentle nature. "Good morning, sir," Mr. Felix greeted, standing near the door. "Good morning, Mr. Felix. Please come in and sit down," Mr. Ade said with a warm smile, gesturing towards the chair in front of him. Mr. Felix walked over and sat down, his hands resting on his knees. "You sent for me, sir?" he asked. "Yes, I did," the principal replied, leaning back in his chair. "But first, how is your family? I hope they're all doing well." Mr. Felix smiled a little. "Yes, sir. We're all doing well, thank you." "That's good to hear," Mr. Ade said, nodding. Then his face turned a bit more serious. "Mr. Felix, I've been meaning to talk to you for a while. You've been here for many years, and I must say, your hard work has not gone unnoticed. Our students perform exceptionally well, especially in science subjects. You've made a real impact." "Thank you, sir," Mr. Felix responded, though he could sense there was more to come. "But," the principal continued, "there is something that we need to address." He leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "I've been receiving complaints, Mr. Felix. Complaints from both parents and students. Mr. Felix raised an eyebrow. Complaints? About what, sir? About your methods of discipline, the principal said seriously. I understand that discipline is important, especially in a school like ours. But flogging, Mr. Felix, cannot be the only solution to every problem. Mr. Felix shifted in his seat but remained silent. The principal sighed softly. Parents have been coming to me, worried about how harsh the punishments are. Some of the students are scared to come to school. They say that you flog them too often, even for small mistakes. This is affecting the reputation of our school. Mr. Felix frowned a little. Sir, you know how these children are. Most of them don't get proper discipline at home. They come here thinking they can misbehave. Flogging is the only thing that makes them behave. The principal shook his head. I understand your concern, but there are other ways to guide them. We're not just here to teach them subjects, Mr. Felix. We're here to shape their character too. And fear is not the way to do that. There was a long pause. Mr. Felix stared at the floor, his mind turning. He knew that some parents and students didn't like his strict ways, but he had always believed he was doing the right thing. He thought it was for their own good. These students are like our own children, the principal said gently, breaking the silence. We must treat them with care, just as we would want our own children to be treated. I don't want to hear any more complaints about excessive flogging. I need you to understand that. Mr. Felix finally looked up, meeting the principal's gaze. I hear you, sir, he said, though his voice was not entirely convinced. But I still believe that some of these children won't learn without strict discipline. I'll try to be less harsh, but I can't promise to stop flogging completely. The principal smiled slightly. I'm not asking you to stop disciplining them, Mr. Felix. I'm asking you to find other ways. Talk to them, counsel them, and guide them. Flogging should be the last resort, not the first. Mr. Felix nodded slowly. I will try, sir. Thank you, Mr. Felix. I know you care about these students, and I appreciate that, the principal said, standing up to signal the end of the conversation. Mr. Felix stood up as well, shaking the principal's hand before walking towards the door. Remember, the principal added as Mr. Felix reached the door, we're here to help them, not harm them. Mr. Felix gave a small nod and walked out of the office, his mind still filled with thoughts. Could he really change his ways? Could he stop the only method of discipline he knew? As he walked back to his classroom, Mr. Felix couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change in the school, but he wasn't sure if it was for better or for worse. Weeks passed, and Mr. Felix's behavior did not change. In fact, things got worse. He continued flogging students, and the complaints from parents increased. Many families were struggling with the extra financial burdens that Mr. Felix imposed, including Daniel's family. It was a warm evening, and Daniel sat on a small wooden stool next to his mother, Mrs. Naomi, who was counting the little money she had earned from her sales at the roadside market. Business had been slow, and she had sold very few items that week. "Mummy," Daniel said softly, looking at the ground. His voice was low, almost as if he didn't want to say what was on his mind. "Mr. Felix, our teacher, said we must bring 5,000 naira to school. He said if we don't pay, we won't be allowed into class." Mrs. Naomi paused from counting the money and looked at her son. Her face was filled with worry. She knew how hard things had been recently. Sales were poor and money was tight. She sighed deeply. "Daniel, my son," she said, her voice full of sadness, "you know I want to give you everything you need for school, but things have been very hard lately. Business is not moving like before. Customers are not buying, and I've only made a small amount of money this week." She placed the money in Daniel's hands. "This is all I have, my child. It's only 2,000 naira. Daniel's face fell as he looked at the money. He knew it wasn't enough, but he didn't want to stress his mother any further. "Mummy," Mr. Felix said, "we need to bring all of the 20,000 naira school fees, not just the 5,000. If we don't bring it all, he said we shouldn't even bother coming to school." "I don't know what to do," Daniel said, his voice shaking with worry. Mrs. Naomi's heart sank. She knew how much Daniel loved school and how hard he worked. She wished she could provide more for him, but life as a widow had not been easy. She had lost her husband in a motorcycle accident 3 years ago, and since then, she had been doing everything she could to take care of Daniel. Selling goods at Aluu Junction was her only means of survival, but sales had been so poor recently that even affording basic things like food was becoming difficult. "My son," Mrs. Naomi said gently, holding Daniel's hand. "You know I would give you more if I had it. But for now, this is all I can afford. Please go to school and explain to Mr. Felix. Tell him your mother is trying her best and that we will pay the money bit by bit. If necessary, I will come to the school and talk to him myself. We will complete the money before the end of the month, I promise." Daniel looked down at the money again, feeling conflicted. He didn't want to disappoint his mother, but he knew Mr. Felix was strict. He wasn't sure if his teacher would understand or show mercy. "No, Mama," Daniel finally said, looking up at her with determination. "You don't need to come with me. I'll talk to Mr. Felix myself. Maybe he will listen if I explain things properly. I believe God will touch his heart, and he will let me attend classes." Mrs. Naomi smiled through her sadness, gently stroking Daniel's cheek. "Yes, my doctor," she said softly, using the nickname she had given him. She always dreamed that Daniel would become a doctor one day. "Since you will be a great doctor in the future, you need to go to school. You must study hard no matter our current situation. I know things will get better soon. Believe that. Don't worry, my son." Daniel hugged his mother tightly. Her words always gave him strength, and he was determined to succeed for her. After the hug, Daniel went inside to prepare for school. He put on his neatly ironed uniform, packed his books into his bag, and got ready to leave. As Daniel walked away, his mother smiled and waved at him. "See you later, my doctor," she called out, trying to keep her voice cheerful despite the heavy burden on her heart. Daniel smiled back at her. "See you later, Mama," he replied before walking toward school. But deep down, Daniel was worried. He wasn't sure how Mr. Felix would react when he told him they couldn't pay the full amount of the fees. The thought of being turned away from school scared him, but he had to try. Mrs. Naomi watched her son leave, her heart filled with both pride and sorrow. She had raised Daniel on her own since his father's death, and he had always been a sweet, helpful child. Even as young as he was, Daniel understood the hardships they faced, and he always did his best to help his mother with sales and house chores. Despite their struggles, he was one of the brightest students in his primary school, graduating with excellent grades. Mrs. Naomi had hoped that he would get a scholarship for secondary school, which would have eased their financial burden. But unfortunately, that hadn't happened. Putting Daniel in Aluu Grammar School, which was more affordable than other secondary schools in the area, had been the best decision she could make. But even the school's fees were difficult for her to manage. Still, she believed in her son's future. She believed he would make it through these difficult times and achieve great things. Daniel walked to school with a heavy heart. The money his mother had given him was still not enough, and he was worried about what Mr. Felix would say. As he approached the classroom, he saw Mr. Felix standing by the door with a stern, angry expression. The long cane in his hand made Daniel even more nervous. "Show your receipt or pay. If you haven't paid, you'll be flogged," Mr. Felix shouted loudly, his voice booming through the corridor. He stood like a guard, his eyes scanning each student as they entered the classroom. Daniel's hands shook as he approached. He held out the money, his voice trembling. "Sir, my mother could only give me half the money for now. She promised to pay the rest by the end of the week," Daniel said. His eyes lowered in fear. Mr. Felix grabbed the money from Daniel's hand and quickly counted it. His frown deepened. "Half," he shouted, his voice filled with anger. "I said full payment. The instructions were very clear. Do you think you are different from the other students?" Daniel swallowed hard, his heart racing. "Please, sir, my mother is trying her best. She will bring the rest soon. Please give me some more time." Mr. Felix's face twisted with rage. So, because your mother says something you think you can disobey my rules. Who is your mother to me? When I give instructions you follow them. Do you understand? Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, Mr. Felix raised his cane high in the air. You will learn to follow instructions. Mr. Felix yelled as he brought the cane down on Daniel's back with force. The sharp pain shot through Daniel's body, but before he could react, another strike landed, then another. Please, sir, Daniel cried out, but Mr. Felix did not stop. The sound of the cane hitting Daniel's body echoed through the hallway. The other students watched in silence, too scared to intervene. You think you can play games with me? Mr. Felix continued, his voice filled with fury. You think you can come to school without paying your fees? With each word he struck Daniel again, harder and harder. Daniel's legs buckled and he fell to his knees. The pain was unbearable, but Mr. Felix showed no mercy. He kept flogging Daniel, shouting about respect and obedience. Suddenly, Daniel collapsed to the ground, his body going limp. His head hit the cold floor with a soft thud, and his eyes closed. Get up, Mr. Felix barked, still holding his cane. I said get up and go to class, but Daniel did not move. Stop pretending, boy, Mr. Felix yelled again, his anger not yet fading. You think you can trick me? One of the students, a small boy named Tund, stepped forward nervously. He bent down and gently shook Daniel's shoulder. Sir, Tund said in a quiet voice. Daniel isn't moving. Mr. Felix rolled his eyes. He's pretending. He's just trying to avoid punishment. But Tund looked worried. He leaned closer to Daniel and placed his hand on his chest. Then his eyes widened with fear. I don't think he's breathing. The words hit Mr. Felix like a punch to the chest. His cane fell from his hand as he rushed over to Daniel's side. He knelt down and shook the boy, but there was no response. Daniel, Mr. Felix shouted, his voice trembling with panic. Daniel, get up. But Daniel's body lay still. The other students began to murmur among themselves, fear spreading like wildfire. Some of them started to cry, realizing that something terrible had just happened. Get the principal, one of the older boys shouted, and a group of students ran off to find help. Mr. Felix's face turned pale. He stood up and took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around wildly, fear gripping him. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had only meant to discipline Daniel, not hurt him this badly. Without thinking, Mr. Felix turned and ran toward the school gate. His only thought was to escape. He couldn't face the consequences of what he had done, but the students were faster. They chased after him, blocking his way. You can't run away from this, one of the boys shouted. The school gateman, seeing the commotion, quickly shut the gate. When Mr. Felix tried to climb over the fence, the students grabbed him and pulled him down. You're not going anywhere, one of the boys yelled as they dragged him back toward the school. The whole school was in chaos. Students were screaming, teachers were running around trying to figure out what was happening, and the principal had been alerted.